Listen Layer really simplifies form tracking. And once you have the basics down, you can start to enhance your data so that you can improve your web analytics and the insights you gain from that. Today, I'm going to walk you through how you can filter out lower quality form submissions from higher quality form submissions inside of your web analytics. And for this, we're going to be using HubSpot Forms. And so I have the listener for HubSpot Forms turned on. Now, if you're new to Listen Layer, make sure that your domain name is properly defined and that the tracking script has been placed on all pages of your website using Google Tag Manager. And then jump into listeners, and you'll want to enable the HubSpot Forms listener or whatever listener you might need for your specific form system. Now, once a listener is enabled, you'll also need to jump to the features screen, and you'll want to turn on some activity features. In this case, we simply have form loads and form submissions turned on for regular HubSpot forms. We don't have anything turned on at this point for other things like pop-up forms. Now, most listeners are structured similarly, where they'll have one or maybe two activity filters and then a few other filters over here on the side. The activity filters are the features in the listener that specifically push activity into the data layer. And so each of these will correspond with at least one event that gets pushed into the data layer when the listener recognizes that information. So here, when a HubSpot form is fully submitted, this event will appear in the data layer along with information about that form. And you can also look at the event settings screen and see that because those features are enabled, the appropriate events are automatically turned on. The last thing to note is that you do need to publish your changes inside of Listen Layer. So we have all of these current settings already published, and we're actually looking at Google Tag Manager in debug mode here. And we're already seeing some of this activity appear in our data layer. So here we have an event which was pushed in when a user submitted a form. You'll notice we have this field, this email field, and the user put value test inside of this. And we most definitely know that if this contains the word test, that we probably shouldn't actually count any conversions. And then we also know that if this value contains the word Gmail or maybe Yahoo, that we should probably consider it maybe a lower quality lead or a lower quality form submission. And we could make a pretty comprehensive list of common personal email domains. And anything that doesn't include the word test and doesn't include those common personal emails is probably a little bit of a higher quality lead. So short of us going and doing some sort of data enrichment to validate business emails, or even if we are doing that, we can still kind of use this field in our data layer to start to identify what's the quality of the form submission that has occurred. And what we'll notice down near the bottom of our data layers, we have this section called custom values. What this allows you to do in Listen Layer is to write rules to push custom values into custom variables that we have defined. And these rules are based on conditions that tend to rely on other information in the data layer. So in theory, we could actually write a rule that says, hey, let's look at this email field whenever this event occurs. And depending on the value in here, let's push some other value into this custom values variable section, grab that inside of Google Tag Manager and do something with it. Decide, for example, that, hey, this is a test submission. Let's just not track conversions. Or this is a lower quality conversion because it looks like it's a personal email. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to jump back to Listen Layer. And we're going to make sure that under customization and storage, we have the custom data layer values feature enabled. And this is what allows you to write rules to push custom values into the data layer. Now, before we jump over here to the custom values screen, it's also important to know that you have to have some variables available to actually push values into. And those variables exist at the global level so that they can apply across multiple listeners. And we actually don't have a variable in here for form quality. So let's go ahead and create one. We're going to save it. Now this is going to be available to write rules to push values into. So now we're going to go to custom values, and you can see we have one rule existing. We're going to create a new rule. And we could create a simple rule or a lookup rule. In this case, the way I'm picturing this kind of in my mind, I'm thinking a lookup rule is going to be more simple to manage, even though it's a little bit more complex to set up. So when you start to define a rule, you have a place to put a name and a description. I recommend obviously documenting things very well. But in this use case, we're just going to jump through. And in this case, we really want this only to apply to form submissions because that's when the email field is going to be populated. So I'm going to limit the scope of this to HS form submitted. Now we would leave this empty if we wanted it to apply to all events inside of HubSpot. And here, what we are looking for is the user's email field. Now, I kind of remember that it was email.value. A lot of times these form fields will have the field itself, and then inside that, there's actually nested information. And I'll show you an easier way to find this in a second, but just to kind of jump back over here, we'll see that we're looking for this field called email, and then we actually really want this node inside of that called value. So I just searched for email.value, and I only got one match. So I just kind of assumed that's what this was, but I'm going to double check. It's form automatic values is the parent, followed by form field values, followed by email, followed by value. And so there's a common kind of path method there that we could follow: form automatic values dot form field values dot email dot values. That appears to be correct. And again, I'll show you in a second an easier way to get that value. So these are the fields that I want to use for my conditions. Now I'm going to select the field that I want to populate when those conditions are met. And that is the field I just created called form quality. So now I'm going to click save and manage values. And what this is going to do is it's going to generate a table. And on the left-hand side here, we have our conditions. And on the right-hand side, we have values. And we can add rows. And so how this works is the rules in the table are read top to bottom. And if there's a match found in the conditions, then it will return the value over here and put it into the data layer in this variable. So what we'll see is that inside of our data layer, when a form is submitted, we're going to have a new variable inside of this called form quality, and it's going to have a value. And that value is going to be whatever we define in this table based on those rules. So I'm going to actually delete these. I'm going to put in a placeholder and save the table. I haven't published anything, but what I want to do is just take a minute to talk a little bit more about the variables themselves. And so I went back in here to edit my rule. And what I'm referring to is this right here. This can be a little bit confusing because it's hard to kind of read and understand these paths if you're not really used to looking at them and maybe looking at code. But it really is quite easy. This is a path just no different than a URL path, except that the forward slashes have basically been replaced with periods. The value node is underneath the email node, which is underneath this form field values, and that's underneath the automatic values. These automatic values are things that Listen Layer sees on your website and specifically inside of whatever application the listener is targeting. So this listener is focused on HubSpot Forms. So every time it sees some activity from HubSpot Forms, we record the instance of all of that information and we put it here. And so you can go back and you can see any of the form field values from any of your HubSpot forms. And it can be a little bit overwhelming. If you have hundreds and hundreds of forms asking different things, you can end up with a lot of stuff here. So this is why, it's important to be kind of consistent in your form configuration inside of HubSpot, but we also try to make it very easy here. You can notice that we automatically just drilled into form field values. I know that is what I'm focused on, is this idea of form field values. And I want this email field, but I notice it's actually got some values inside of it. And here's this one that I want called value. So I'm actually I'm going to put a friendly name on this. Now, this is not going to change the actual variable name in the data layer. It's just going to make it a little bit easier for me to find inside of listen layer. Type correctly here. So I'm going to call this user email. And if you want, you can see the actual path is right here too, so you can confirm that. Now, because I have a friendly name, if I had thousands and thousands of forms, that makes it a lot easier to find that field. So I could kind of find it once, and if I need to use it across multiple rules, I can now, find it way easier. So if I go back into my rules here, what we'll notice is now it's renamed user email, and it's the same field. It's just using the friendly name. And so I can search here, just search for user email, and now I can kind of confirm that I have the right variable. So back on my table, I want this event to happen, and I want something to, specific to be inside the user's email field. And then I want to return something inside the form quality. So I'm going to add a few rows. And I know that I always want this form submission or form submitted event to be true. And let's just start with test. If the user's email includes the word test, then I want to actually just return the value test, or maybe test form submission. And if the value contains something like Gmail, I probably want to call it a low quality submission. Now you can put whatever values you want here. This one I'm also going to call a low quality. And then let's just assume that this list is comprehensive and I want everything else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this wildcard here, which kind of matches everything else. And I'm going to label it as regex. I'm just going to call this, I may not want to call it high quality because I don't know for sure. I'm just going to call it maybe normal quality. Again, you can formulate this however you want. This is why I encourage companies, organizations to really focus on building a data framework, a framework for how you are going to operate, how you're going to measure quality, how you're going to segment, how you're going to have some sort of common lingo, and then use Listen Layer to really allow you to implement that and normalize your data. So what's going to happen here is when this event occurs and we have a value in the user email, it's going to match one of these rules. It's going to read it from top to bottom. So if it matches this first one, it's going to stop and it's just going to return this value inside of this variable. And it does that for every single variable that exists. So in this case, we only have one. And so it's going to return these values based on this in the data layer. So let's go ahead and publish. Oh, and real fast, this last one, this is just the catch-all, right? So this regular expression basically says anything else, we're just going to call it this. And that's why it's important to have this at the very bottom, because all your more detailed rules are above it and they'll get matched first. But if they're not matched, it'll kind of fall all the way down to this one. So now we are going to publish this, and we're going to call this form quality. And we already have our debug open. I tend to like to just do a hard refresh just in case there's any changes going on the website. And also possibly make sure that I'm working in the correct workspace here. And so I just refreshed my debug view. Let's make sure our data layer is working. So I'm going to visit the HubSpot forms page on our test website. And I should see some form loaded activity occurring here. And I do. And that's also going to be appearing over here. And it looks like my form is already pre-populated with some test information. So I'm just going to go ahead and submit this. And we have a successful submission. We have an event in our data layer called HS form submitted. And we're going to drill into this. And let's hope that our publishing worked correctly. And it did. So you can see form custom values. Form category equals demo, form name equals US region. These were coming from our previous rule that we had already defined here. But notice now we have a new value called form quality, and it is a test submission. And that's because it's specifically looking at this field, and it knows that it's a test submission. So now a very simple thing that we can do is on our form triggers, whatever triggers we've created inside of Google Tag Manager, which would obviously target this HS form submitted event, we can actually have that trigger not occur if this form quality equals test submission. Now, let's go ahead and put in something like the Yahoo. Oh, and it looks like HubSpot's not actually going to let me submit that on that form because it validates the it's not going to let me do it there either. So HubSpot is actually validating and rejecting that email anyway. So let's put in kind of what I would consider maybe a more of a standard work email. And we'll go ahead and submit this. And what we should see is that we now have a normal quality submission because it read that form quality table top to bottom, and it's matched on this bottom row. So inside of Google Tag Manager now, like I said, we can create triggers that would target the event. So we might create a new trigger, and it's going to be a custom event, and we may want to target, or we are going to want to target this HS form submitted event. So we would put that in here, and then we could modify this trigger based on some variables. So we can capture this individual variable called form quality inside of Google Tag Manager, and we can use that to modify the trigger. Now, most people know how to use these triggers, so I'm going to focus on just capturing that variable. And then you can work on how you might want to incorporate that into your tracking. So we're going to go to variables. We're going to click new variable, and we're going to select a data layer variable. And this is where the path of this variable becomes important. I showed you there's a couple ways. In this case, we're working with a custom variable. So we're just going to go in here and we're going to right click on it. And we're going to go copy property path. And we're on the console of the browser there. that didn't work. I think I need to expand. So I'm clicking on the correct one. And I want form quality. What this does is it'll make this variable available inside of Google Tag Manager now to use. So like I said, we can modify a trigger, but something else that we could do is we could actually send this as a property into Google Analytics 4. So we could create a Google Analytics 4 event. We could say, here's our form submission event. And we're going to trigger this maybe on all of my HubSpot form submissions. And I want to actually have a variable called form quality, and I'm going to push form quality, the one that I just created, into this. Now I can do a kind of a double bracket there, and I can just grab it, or I can click on the lookup and I could find this form quality. And so what this would do then is it would allow me to actually, inside of Google Analytics, maybe create 3 different conversions, or maybe 2 different conversions. I would ignore the tests. I might create a lower quality conversion for the personal emails, and I might create a higher quality conversion for the ones that come in with more of a normal business email address. And that's one way that you can use that as far as being able to collect and kind of save that information in GA4. So this is one of the more advanced features inside of Listen Layer, this ability to define custom values inside of the data layer. What we walked through today was a very basic example of this, but also a very powerful one that would allow you to enhance the quality of your data. And that's what I would encourage is after you get into Listen Layer and just start using the very basics, then I would focus on 2 different areas. How do I segment my data better by maybe passing in some additional information? And how do I enhance the quality of my data by starting to filter out, what might be considered junk so we can actually focus on what's real? Listen Layer is free to start, free to use. You only have to pay if you need a certain level of volume of usage, or if you're looking to use one of our premium features. But most of this is available on the free plan. So I hope you get in there, start learning, start building some really cool things, and then share them with us.